Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to our Basel Miami Beach Conversations, the final conversation on the first day. I'm very excited to introduce you this talk, Looking Towards Sustainable Funding Structures in Latin America. Moderating this conversation is our good friend Chris Sharp, who is a curator, a writer, well actually he does a lot of things, but let's just leave it at that, and is based in Mexico City. Please join us in welcoming all the speakers. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay, so this is on. Great. Thank you for having me. Really happy to be here from Mexico City in Miami. And happy to moderate this panel, looking towards sustainable funding structures in Latin America, with such an esteemed group of colleagues from all over Latin America. Basically, in keeping with the title, the panel will be about sustainable funding structures in Latin America. And I think to begin with, it's important to state that Latin America is obviously really rich and varied, and that the cultures of funding vary from country to country. And to that end, it's great that we have speakers from Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and then also one who's based in Peru. To my immediate left is Maria Mercedes Gonzalez, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, Medellin. She's been the director since 2012 and recently oversaw and stewarded the museum's much celebrated expansion in 2017. Left of her is Alec Oxenford, Argentine collector based in Buenos Aires, the president of arteBA, the art fair in Buenos Aires, which is also a foundation. And then Gabriela Garza is a Mexican collector based in Mexico City. She is the president of the board of Bellas Artes in Mexico City, sits on the board of MUAC in Mexico City as well, and is on the board of LACMA in Los Angeles and the Aspen Art Museum in Aspen. And then last but not least is Yoss, formerly director of Hauser and Wirth, who founded in 2015, I'm correct, Proyecto Amil, a fluid and non-commercial contemporary art form based in Lima. After that brief introduction, I think it's good to get to know our speakers from their own point of view a bit. And also, since we're discussing funding structures in Latin America, in the US, I think it's important that each panelist speak about or try and say a little bit about the particularities of their respective contexts with regard to fundraising. So go ahead and start with Gabriela, Maria.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to our Basel for having us. As Chris mentioned, I'm the director of the Medellin Museum of Modern Art since 2012. The museum is a non-profit private institution located in the second largest city in Colombia. Medellin is one of the most important economic centers, and during the 80s and the 90s, the city was sadly one of the most dangerous and violent cities in the whole world. In the last decades, however, I would say the last 2 decades, the city has undergone through a huge urban and social transformation process, which has improved the quality of life, which has improved security within the city. It's a transformation process that today is widely known, and is a transformation process that in some way has made the transformation of the museum possible as well. I'm going to talk about our fundraising strategies and campaigns in the recent years. As I said before, the museum is a private institution. It was founded in 1978. This year, we celebrated our 40th anniversary. And the museum was funded by a group of artists intellectuals and citizens in Medellin. So back in 2015, we completed a 6-year expansion project with the opening of a new building of more than 7,000 square meters, a new building that includes new galleries, more space for our permanent collection, new services for the audiences, a theater, multiple rooms. And for that project, we led a successful fundraising campaign. So we tried to convince both the public and the private sectors to participate in a sort of a 50-50 partnership, which is a type of alliance that has worked really, really well in Medellin, unlike other Colombian cities, and I would say unlike other Latin American cities. And this private-public partnership has also made some of the biggest social and educational projects possible in Medellin. So this project was a $12 million project. The local municipality, the mayor's office, invested $6 million, and we raised 6 more among a group of family foundations and corporations, basically from Medellin, that today are closely connected and closely engaged with the museum. So in a way, this expansion helped us to build a strong relationship with these sponsors, a strong relationship with the local municipality as well, and it also helped us to plant the seed of the long-term sustainability, which was also like one of the main objectives of the expansion project. So what did we do? We communicated the idea that the museum is for the common good, that the museum expansion was a project that concerns the whole city. We also communicated the idea that the museum expansion would contribute to revitalize the neighborhood in which it's located, and we also contribute to revitalize the public space surrounding the museum. And we also communicated the idea that the museum expansion was an expression of a wider transformation, which was the transformation of the city, and also that expansion project was also an expression of a vibrant and growing Colombian art scene, especially in the last 2 decades. So what do we have today? Today we have an annual budget of $2.2 million that comes from very different sources. 45% of the revenues comes from the private sector, a group of family foundations, corporations whose headquarters are mainly in the city. 35% earned revenue, the museum store, admissions, the renting out of some of the museum spaces. 17% from the local municipality, which is a big effort of the municipality, and only 3% from the national government. So unfortunately, I'd say that we received a small amount of resources from the national government, and it is a fact that the visual arts sector has not been on the top priorities of the national government, of the Ministry of Culture. There's, in Colombia, we don't have, and I think we were talking about this, we don't have a tax incentive structure that really encourages corporate or individual giving. As it does exist in the US. I know that it exists in in Mexico, I don't know in what extent, but in Colombia we don't have something like that. And I feel that today we don't have like a strong public policy that really helps the visual arts sector. So after 3 years of expanding the museum and of having expanded the museum and having reoriented its programming, I think that one of the key issues for our economic sustainability has been keeping the stakeholders on board, keeping the stakeholders close to the museum and trying to locating new ones in this new chapter of the museum.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing that popped out for me was this idea of the common good, that there is like some kind of culture of art patronage, and I think it's interesting that it's like this idea of the common good is linked to a kind of previous crisis situation, you know, like where it's like a general development for everyone. So I think that's something that's really interesting and obviously very particular to a historical moment in Colombia that you're now, weirdly enough, benefiting from despite the lack of incentive. Maybe to switch it up, we could hear a bit more from Gabriela at this point about your activities you know, as a collector and a board member in Mexico, and then maybe you can tell us a bit about the kind of incentive structure in Mexico as well.
Well, hi, I'm Gabriela Garza. I live in Mexico City, and thank you, Basel, for inviting me to this conversation. I never thought I was going to be an art collector. I don't really understand what that means. The only thing is that I love art and we really like it, and it's part of my life, it's part of my family, and that's how we started, and now we are here. So one thing takes you to another, like being in the art. Then they started inviting me to museums to support exhibitions in the States. My first experience was in the US with American museums, and then after I started, because I have a lot of curiosity, so I wanted to learn more about the art, and I wanted to be involved in education in Mexico. So I said, what can I do? Well, a little bit that I can do. So that's how I got involved with Bellas Artes, and it's been so interesting, all the things that I've learned about Mexican culture and the way that they do exhibitions and they organize everything. But also I've learned that with fundraising and the funds from the government is very complicated. So I've been working there like almost 5 years, and I don't really know how it works. I don't know or what you think. So, and it's very different because also I have the opportunity that I've been invited to some museums in the U.S., and it's so different, as you know. So I don't know.
What are some of the specific differences between the U.S. and Mexico?
Well, the tax is also very important, and we've been trying to understand, like, since they gave me the plan of the conversation. I've been talking to several friends that really support the very important museums in the U.S., and what they can do is amazing, because I've seen the buildings that they've done. I've seen the exhibitions that they can do. They can do like parks, and they can do new museums. You can build. You can have the best architects in the world, and it's very supportive. In Mexico, it's so difficult. It's so difficult because, like I called my friends and I said, let's support this exhibition for Bellas Artes. We did an amazing project with Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and it was really spectacular, but I had like to call everybody to get the funds because some pieces they were gonna stay behind, they couldn't come, and so I had like to call everybody and try to convince them to help us have this exhibition. So, and then, well, there's no fun, there's no tax.
There's less tax break incentive.
Yes, so we work with what we can, and I try to help as much as we can. Also, in Mexico, we've been very supportive during the fair, the MACO. The MACO, so for a lot of people at the beginning, and for Americans, it was very hard to come to Mexico because they see the news and they were saying it's so dangerous. How do you have your family, or how do you walk in the streets? So I invited some of the museum directors and curators also to stay in my house to be comfortable. Now they go to Mexico and they don't even call me. So I think now they're liking it and they feel comfortable. Huh? No, it's true.
Yeah, there's definitely different ways to be supportive. I think that's great. Alec, maybe you could tell us a bit about what you're doing in the context in Argentina.
Yeah, my name is Alec Oxenford. I'm president of arteBA. Is Imagine Basel for Argentina. Cooler. What I've seen from what I understand here in the U.S., all the incentives around being a patron, being a philanthropist, donating money are aligned and favorable. On the first hand, socially, being an art patron, donating money to NGOs is very well seen. You can see movies, people get awards, it's very prestigious. So socially, and here in Miami this week, there's multiple big collections that belong to individuals and families who open their houses more or less as mini museums, and they're very open. People can come, walk around, see their art, etc. It's very public, very visible. It's very well reputed to contribute and to open your art to society. On the government side, there's very clear direct and indirect incentives. Direct incentives, again, just very simple. This building we are in, which cost a fortune to renovate, a big part of that fortune was paid by the city of Miami, to a large degree to allow this fair to take place in the right context. And the same thing happens with MoMA in New York and many other places. Now, if in Argentina the government decided to donate to a museum like Malva, for example, which is an NGO, a non-profit organization, a huge sum of money to expand the museum, there would be a scandal. It would be completely unacceptable. It would be considered completely politically incorrect. So there's a second big difference. In Argentina, people don't open up, don't show, very low profile, very low key for many reasons. Here it's completely the opposite. Directly the government helps a lot here. Directly the government for private institutions and NGOs helps, but at a very, very different level. Now, indirectly, again, huge difference. Here, if you donate $20 million, many of the patrons of, for example, MoMA donate up to $150 million. I mean, huge amounts of money. In most cases, almost 100% deducted from taxes. Whereas in Argentina, to deduct from taxes, there's very low limits. It's up to 5% at best of what you're supposed to pay from taxes, whereas here is almost 100%. So huge, enormous difference. But then, even that is very complicated. Logistically, it's difficult. The organization needs to be approved by the government and considered exempt, all kinds of filings. It's extremely complicated. To add on top of that, there's an issue of safety. people in Latin America in general, in Argentina in particular, feel very uncomfortable making public big check donations and making public statements of their wealth. Their personal safety is considered to be at risk, so people just don't do it for that reason either. There's a few exceptions to that general trend where adversity is the rule in terms of participating, donating money to NGO and art NGOs in Argentina. One of them is in the city level of Buenos Aires, not national level, but city level. There's a new patronage law that came out, which expanded and improved the previous ones. So it is possible to get some tax deductions if you are donating within the context of the city of Buenos Aires. Now, the catch there is that unfortunately most individuals don't pay the taxes that the city collects. It's revenue tax, which almost 100% of the time only applies to companies. And even then there's limits and processes and the projects need to be approved, whereas here they don't need to be approved. You donate and that's it. You don't need somebody to approve a small sample of a big request. So way, way more complicated. Now, in spite of all of this, there is some contribution going on. I love to mention Malva. It's a fantastic museum. I think one of the best museums in its field, probably one of the best museums in the world. And it's 100% or 90% based on donations, and of that 90% of an individual. So, and he not only donated the building, but the collection and also the maintenance. So there are some examples, and there's a few others, but you can count them with your hands. Very, very limited group. Now, reasons to be optimistic. First of all, I think more and more people are looking around and realizing that in other places these things are easier and more the incentives are just more aligned. And I suspect there will be some pressure going forward once the government is, less complicated financially, to be more generous with these laws, and hopefully that will happen. In Brazil, there was an interesting experiment. Again, just to use this fair as an example, Art Rio and Art Sao Paulo in Brazil actually have a special treatment. There's an umbrella. Those, the days for the fairs, approximately 10 days for each one of the fairs, the national taxes are reduced. So if importing a piece of art into Brazil, and this is ballpark numbers, costs 50% in taxes, that week in those fairs it costs 20% in taxes. So huge advantage to bring over art into Brazil, which is fantastic. Brazil has more art in its, in its sovereign environment, and those buying it do it cheaper. But again, that was a law at a national level passed for those two fairs. I think, one last thing, very interesting. If you want to receive a donation for an NGO in Argentina, actually the most efficient way to do so, if you happen to have businesses in multiple jurisdictions around the world, is to do it via Help Argentina. Help Argentina is actually an American NGO, which qualifies as a 501c3 organization, which means they can receive donations just like any other NGO nonprofit in the US to the full extent of the discounts by law. Now, that being the case, this is very funny. You can, if an Argentine person has businesses in the US and those businesses pay taxes in the US, then that person can actually donate to this Argentine venture via Help Argentina, deducting a lot more taxes than if you were doing the same thing in Argentina to the same institution. So I think that should be an eye-opener for politicians in the country for the future.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. Thank you. And Joel.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hi.
to you. If you want to just tell us a bit about your project and your involvement in Lima, and then I know that you're not necessarily in the nonprofit sector, but just give us a sense of the context as well.
Sure. Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to Mary for inviting me to participate in the panel, and to Chris for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
To you, Chris, for moderating, and to my fellow panelists. Let's see, I think I approach this from a slightly different angle because I have a different experience. I come from a commercial gallery experience where I was a director in London and New York for around 18 years before I moved to this position of having founded Proyecto Amil in Lima with Juan Carlos Verme. And we're entirely privately funded, and we're a not-for-profit organization. So we make exhibitions, we publish catalogs, we have a residency program. All of this comes from the funding of one individual. So I don't have to go. I don't have to, and we actually, it would be a very different experience for me to have to go looking for money for my projects throughout the city of Lima, because it's very complicated and there's not a lot of money there to support artists or exhibitions. Juan Carlos is also the president of the Mali, which is the Fine Arts Museum in Lima, and they constantly have a difficult time raising money for their museum for any exhibition, whether it's a local artist or some internationally known artist. What we try to do, I think, in terms of if I think about funding structures or what our mission is really to help generate and fund local artists and generate ideas and make it possible for artists to exhibit and to realize projects and artworks. We really see our Proyecto Amil as a platform of exchange, between local scene and an international scene. So we fund artists by buying their works or making exhibitions, but we also fund them by giving them an exhibition space and allowing local collectors to come in and buy works from them. So we have exhibitions that are non-selling exhibitions, but we've also had 3-day artist-run art fairs. So we provide a platform, we provide the space and the means and a certain amount of money for the artist to make work, and then we will generate some activity with the local community and allow people to come in and buy artwork directly from the artist. So in that sense, that's how I feel like we're helping to sustain the local scene there. One of the other really interesting things that we do, and I think most rewarding things that we do, is try to make all of our exhibitions or all of our projects context related or context specific to us. So we don't waste energy on importing artworks or importing so many things from Europe or from the States that would be expensive and also be, I think, more difficult for people to access. Having said that, we did just open a Yoko Ono exhibition, which it's very different for us, and it was actually, you may have seen it, Alec. It was originated in Malba in Buenos Aires. So this is the last stop on the tour. But this was a very unique exhibition for us, where we did not generate our own content. We actually took an exhibition that was curated, without us. But I think, as you said, Gabriela, it's very difficult in Mexico or in countries like Peru or Colombia to find the money and also to know exactly where it's coming from. You have to be aware of some of this money has sort of some questionable sources, and so if you are getting people involved, I think you need to be careful about just who those people are, because there's a lot of situations where other institutions in Lima have had problems with some sort of scandals involved with where the money's coming from.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I wonder if that couldn't be said about most institutions.
I mean, that could probably be said about any place or any, many different countries. But I think in Latin America, you do have to be, I think, especially concerned or especially aware.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, it's funny working in Latin America, and sometimes you're working with artists in Europe or different parts of the world. You always, or myself, I always have to find like interesting solutions to like make things happen, where there is a kind of, you could say, a certain lack of support. Yeah, I mean, thank you all very much for that. I think maybe at this point we could talk about like alternative or sustainable fundraising methods or ideas that you might have. I mean, in preparing and thinking about this talk, I thought a lot about the context of Mexico, where I'm based, and some of the challenges we face. One challenge is every 6 years there's a new presidential administration, and it's amazing in Mexico, like everything changes. Like everybody loses their jobs, and like all the institutions have to hire again, and projects that are in the works get canceled, and it's almost as if it renews itself entirely every 6 years. And for me, and I think obviously a lot of people in Mexico, that leads to a problem of consistency and dependability. I think another problem that we face in Mexico is that we do have these certain funding structures, but they will only fund for a year, which helps, obviously. It's great to have funding, but a year is a very short amount of time in the art world. And like, how do you really make a difference in a year? And how do you not just become a kind of year-long pop-up or something like that? So I think that's something that we're thinking about in Mexico, or that we need to think about. But yeah, I'm wondering if there are any specific issues that you have had to face, like in Colombia or Buenos Aires, crisis situations or new challenges for which you've had to find new solutions. I thought what Alec mentioned about this kind of circuitous NGO in the United States, this is ingenious. This is really smart in terms of like circumventing these specific tax laws. But I'm wondering if there are other things like that you could discuss, or ideas that you had which you think could be beneficial to Mexico, Argentina, or Colombia.
Well, I think we should use technology and to get access to more people and make it easier, not to get donations that are so expensive and hard to raise. We should make it more accessible for more people so they can donate for institutions. So that's an idea that we should start thinking about it. Because also in the institutions in Mexico that are run by the government, we don't get the money of the tickets that we sell.
Where does that money go?
To Hacienda. Yes.
And, could you say what is Hacienda?
Huh?
The IRS.
The IRS. Okay,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Just for people in the audience.
Yes. So the money, the entrance of the museums, they go to the government. So we don't count with that money. Huh?
That's amazing. It's funny how in some, and Alec touched upon this as well, of like this idea of like something you said to be optimistic about is this idea of the common good. This is something that's emerging in Argentine consciousness of like this. Actually, this is a good thing. It's almost as if the Bilbao, well, for better or for worse, effect hasn't happened there yet.
Yeah. I think that the role models are very relevant in any activity. I mean, most people just don't know what is possible, and sometimes assume that things are impossible when they are not. So identifying those individuals who, in spite of all the hardship, manage to participate, donate their time, donate money, raise funds, etc. Identifying them and broadcasting them, making it visible for society that that is actually possible and that it is happening, is a big, big step forward. I suspect that many others will mimic it. And maybe a simple way to do this is to, for the government to identify whatever, 10 or 20 or 50, whatever, a significant number of individuals and companies, and come up with a very, it's important, very visible recognition for them doing this. I suspect many others will mimic after that. arteBA has a couple of creative solutions as well, which involve, our narrow focus is of course on art fair in Argentina, but our broader focus has to do with pushing Argentine culture, all over the world. And so it is important for us, for example, that pieces of art from Argentine authors are exhibited in relevant museums around the world, because we believe that that establishes a relevant dialogue between Argentine art and the rest of the world's art, etc., etc. So with that vision in mind, we developed a matching funds system, which was pioneer globally as far as we know, where a relevant number of museums, including, for example, the Tate, Guggenheim, Reina Sofia, many museums around the world, come to Argentina, to arteBA, and they buy a piece of art, and that piece of art gets fully or partially funded by individuals who participate in that process. Now, what are the institutional changes that we implemented to facilitate that? And why does it happen and it doesn't happen in many other places? Well, first of all, arteBA has a reputation for being, a very professional and solid organization that guarantees that the logistics and the money transfers and everything else is 100% kosher. The second thing that happens is those participating are actually given visibility. So their donation appears in the museum where it's going to be exhibited with their name if they so desire. Lastly, the museums participating thank very formally all those participating and sometimes provide them with privileges in their museum. So there's benefits to everybody. The artist gets their work exhibited in a relevant museum where it wouldn't have been had it not been the case for this initiative. The museum gets to buy it at a big discount or for free. Those participating don't have to go through the whole hassle because we help them with all the logistics and everything around. And everybody is happy in the end. Now, it does generate significant work, but this is just an example of, because we don't have many other institutional ways to do this in a more generalized way, well, we come forward, step up, take the situation and try to fill in the gaps of all the problems out there.
So yeah, we at MAM, we were concentrated in particular this year into different initiatives, no new initiatives. One, we tried to explore in depth the universe of grants, which takes time, is a long process, is a lot of paperwork, but we just got an amazing grant from Terra Foundation. There are wonderful opportunities there. It's not easy to find the correct grant or the one that fills the needs of your project. But once you get it, I mean, it's a great opportunity. And the other one is endowments. I think that American museums have a lot to teach us about endowments. So this year we tried to create a very small endowment, which also demands fundraising, time, a lot of effort. But when you see the composition of the income of American museums, you see that endowments today represent around 20 or 22% of the revenues of American museums. So we are trying to, copy in the way what endowments could represent in the future. No, it's a long-term initiative, but I think it's worth it to start.
And do either of you have anything you'd like to add to that? I mean, you already touched upon this a little bit, Gabby, but I remember in our former discussions about this topic, you had this one idea, which I found interesting, about investing, if I remember correctly. No?
Investing in...
Well, you mentioned something about not immediately spending money or donations on specific exhibitions, but finding a way to kind of, I guess, save it, invest it, or yeah.
Yes, we talked about like when you get like donations, because in Bellas Artes we get sometimes big donations. But the problem is that we don't have the time to invest it, because as soon as you get it, you have to pay it the next day. You're always late. So even if we have money, we don't have time to invest it or to do a business with it. So I don't know, what can we do? Like, everything is like last minute. They need it. They need it, so you don't have time to invest it. We have a very big donation that we get for all the books, for all the exhibitions. So it's very hard, like, after the exhibition to sell it. Like, I don't know if you want to buy some books. We have a lot.
Yeah, I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask, but it looks like we're almost out of time at this point. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. In the initial point, well, I guess Maria Mercedes, you had a great question that I guess we could end with this, and you guys, in some ways, have already touched upon it. But I guess I would like to know, what is one particular fundraising method or initiative which you feel like has really worked in Argentina or Colombia, Mexico, and then Peru?
I think trust is very important, that the people feel that they can trust you, because in our countries, trust is a very complicated thing. Also, like with governments and things that I think we all experience in our countries is complicated. So if the people trust you, it's a little easier, not easy, but it can be a little easier. I think so.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a fair amount of corruption to fight against. So, yeah, it creates a kind of culture of mistrust.
Yeah, maybe in the same direction. arteBA is one of the older NGOs in the country, in Argentina. We're going to be 30 years old very soon, which is eternity for an NGO in Argentina. And the reason why that has been possible is because there's a very solid institution behind it. There's a board of directors that is very well reputed, and a lot of scrutiny gets into those participating there. Very high moral expectations from everybody involved. And a very, very direct focus on elaborating and developing and keeping a brand which reflects very high standards of quality. Now, that has all kinds of repercussions. For example, we intend to be around for a very, very long time. So if we operate in a context where the macroeconomy is volatile, for example, well, then we need to have part of our reserves in dollar denomination, because there's devaluations in Argentina. Now, that's not by, and we're also super conservative with the management of our reserves. Well, the consequence of doing that is when something happens, like it happened a couple of months ago, when there was a big devaluation, well, we were not negatively impacted, whereas everybody else who didn't have, take the responsible approach of keeping reserves for a rainy day separate and keeping them in dollars was very negatively affected. So everything we do is focused on the long run. Now that attracts sponsors who also want to support initiatives that they know will be around in the long run as well. So I believe that in a context like Latin America, where there's a lot of volatility, the rule of law is dubious sometimes, etc., making an extra effort to go and be an example of institutional, of institutionality, and a very, very like an oasis where values and what we stand for is really stands out as something special and unique, I think is a very, very, very good policy for fundraising continuously going forward. The second one would be, I think, you need to be very atomized because things change so much. It's much better to have a fragmented base of donors. No donor of arteBA contributes more than 15% of the budget by definition. That's extremely relevant.
This is super important. Yeah, when you have just one donor, I mean, you make yourself very vulnerable.
Yeah. So there's lots of details like those which are completely there by design, which make it easier and more sustainable to fundraise in the future. I think it's a collection of those small details rather than one silver bullet that explains it.
And did you want to add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, maybe more than a strategy, some lessons. Again, be aware of the costs of raising money, as you mentioned before. The engagement and the commitment of the board of directors is crucial as well. In Colombia, we don't have trustees in the American way. We have a board of directors. It means that they participate or they exercise the role without paying and without being paid. And that engagement and that commitment is crucial for fundraising. And again, difficulties cannot limit the institution of thinking big, no? The ambitions of the institution cannot be limited because of economic constraints of economic difficulties. I think that's one of the main lessons.
I absolutely agree. I think it's very important to think very ambitiously in terms of, I mean, almost to be quixotic, to think, not in terms of funding or what you have, but rather what you want to do, and find a way to do it, to make it happen. I mean, it sounds very quixotic, but I think it's important. I think when you think the other way, you just really limit yourself and you end up thinking small. I think it's better to think big and then just try and get there however you can. Yeah. Well, I think at this point, we've talked for quite a while, and it'd be nice to hear from the audience to see if anyone has any specific questions, criticisms, doubts.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for all of your presentations. I have one question. Two questions, actually. What is the role of corporations in this sustainability of funding for Latin American cultural structures, and what would be the perfect mix in order to achieve that sustainability? Corporate, public, private money, crowdfunding.
Maria, one of you.
Okay, so I don't know if there is a perfect mix, but I suspect that a mix is good, like a percentage of each. Given, again, ideological and political volatility in Latin America, I would keep government contributions way below 50%, because you never know what's going to happen in the future, and you put at risk the whole system if you depend too much on the government. So I would keep it, for sure, not over 25% or 30%. with regards to the role of corporations, like at least in what we do, for example, I think there's a very important role, and some institutions around the world have done this, which has to do with corporate collecting. I think that there's all kinds of positive incentives into the system when big institutions start regularly investing money that ends up in, because they invest regularly in buying, for example, paintings or sculptures or whatever it is that they're collecting, that money flows through the system to the galleries, to the artists, and to everybody else who participates. And it's a very good way to do this, because there's market pricing for what's going on. The works can be seen and they can be cataloged, and there's an inventory, and they're there. So that I think is something that in Latin America would be fantastic if we did a lot more, replicating some great examples, particularly of some Swiss companies and also some American companies. And lastly, what I would say is, for corporations as well, I would make it much more visible when they contribute. Sometimes I think that corporations are a bit shy. They think that if they make it too explicit that they're helping an NGO or a non-profit, it'll backlash, because people will consider them that they're not really good. They're only doing it because it brings publicity. And there's a bit of that sometimes, but we should turn it around. They should promote it extensively in order for others to copy them and to replicate those good actions.
Hi, here. More on a suggestion than a question, but listening to Maria Mercedes and Alec and also Gabriela, I think that it would be great if we could share. I'm sorry, I'm Enrique Abogado, I'm Cultural Minister for the City of Buenos Aires here. And it would be great if we could share this information between ourselves somehow, what you are researching in terms of how you use endowment, a tool that is not very well used in our region, but you are exploring that. Or what Alec just said in terms of how we can build incentives to have corporate collection. I think that we have lessons to be learned and shared, best practices that can be somehow moved around. So it's just a suggestion, but it would be great if we can build this sort of best practices library in our region. Because of course our reality is so different to other regions that it needs also particular tools catered towards our reality. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question, sort of as a balance to this idea of the corporate private. Joel, I see lots of single patron institutions popping up all over the world. Like, this is sort of a phenomenon of this generation. Do you, like from the Mucha Prada to India, everywhere, do you see that by doing this, you guys are also leaders in empowering other people that they can also start foundations like this, single patron foundations?
Certainly, I think that's one of the biggest ways we can contribute to Lima and to the artistic community there is by setting an example and making these opportunities exist for the artist and also for patrons, potential patrons, or people who would like to get involved and did not know how. For sure, I think I would totally agree with you in that we're in a new era of these private museums, private institutions. In our case, it started in a very organic way. We had this ever-growing collection of stuff that was sitting in storage that we wanted to exhibit. So we started forming exhibitions around the objects that we had. Then that suddenly became we wanted to make books. We wanted to bring artists to Lima to have residencies with us to make art and talk about art and create a community of artists and writers. And so in doing that, I think that we set an example for other potential collectors and other people who would like to be involved in Lima. So I think we're doing well. I think we're doing good at that. I think I feel confident about what we've been able to do. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that.
I agree. I think it's an important thing, but I think that kind of brings up another discussion about sustainability that Alec touched upon in terms of like, I don't know, in Mexico, there's a big controversy at the moment that one of the major collectors who had a foundation decided to drop out of contemporary art literally overnight, employed many people. I mean, sorry to end this on such a dark note, but this was his thing, and it was called Alumnos 47, and very involved with publishing, funding, and he just dropped out overnight. And there is this, and I think this is something that Alec kind of touched upon, in that, it's important to have different sources of funding, different kind of people involved, and I'm not against this at all. I mean, I think this is a great thing as well. The space that you've opened up in Lima, especially in terms of like inspiration, and like showing that these kind of things can be done. But then I just think, like, how do you sustain that?
That's true.
Given these points of vulnerability,
I think we also get another problem. I don't know what you think, because when private collectors, they do their own institutions, they stop supporting the existing ones.
Yeah.
So I think that's also a big problem, because they start to have their own museums and foundations, so they can't support all the museums. So there's so many places and museums to support. Why do more?
And
I don't know. Huh?
It's
In Mexico, yes.
It's funny. Mexico is crazy. You can see.
Yes.
You can see contemporary art in over 20 institutions in Mexico, which I think is good, but at the same time, I mean, I'm thinking about the initial prompt of this discussion of like, do better with less? And I actually, I don't know that Mexico needs 20 institutions for contemporary art. I mean, what if it just had 5 institutions with really strong programs and funding? I mean, it's like, if you talk to the general public, and they'll probably be able to name like 3 institutions, and one will be like the Museum of Anthropology, where you can't see contemporary art. And I just wonder, I think it could be. I mean, it depends on the country. I mean, Colombia obviously doesn't have nearly as many museums, or Argentina, but Mexico, it's like Austria or something, or France. It's insane. On one hand, it's amazing. On the other hand, it's like, I've lived there for 6 years, and I'm still discovering museums where you can see contemporary art. Yeah, so. Yeah. Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Flavia Brenci, the director Mario Cucinella Architects in New York. And we were, I don't know if you know, but we were the curator of Italian Pavilion in Biennale in Venice this year. So to find the private funding, it's easy for the huge project like a Colosseum in Italy, or for the Biennale in Venice. But for the small project, what we can do? Because there are so many small projects that we can help, and it's not so easy. And in your country, what you can do? It's not just Michelangelo's or Leonardo, because for Michelangelo and Leonardo we can find a lot of money, but there are so many interesting things to do, and it's not so easy to help them.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't be answering this question, but I think in Mexico there are different governmental and kind of private fundraising initiatives, which I think are really interesting. One is PAC, which you probably know about. It was started by a couple of curators, where that's precisely what they do, is they gather funding. I think it's 15 years old, if I remember correctly, and they gather funding precisely for small projects, for artist-run spaces, or independent spaces or specific artistic like shows or even a single project like a work. And I think that's their focus. And I think in Mexico you have kind of different levels. I think it's important that initiatives exist like that.
Works, yeah. It's just because in Italy, for example, De La Valle was the sponsor of Colosseum conservation, and but it was just because De La Valle, everyone see this name everywhere on the Colosseum. It's important for them to show what they are doing. In the small project, you can't recognize this kind of things, and it's not anthropologist anymore. It's something that you have to show what you said before. I agree with you. It's if you do something, you don't have to say your hand.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Maybe they could just fund billboards. Anything else? If not, I think we can go ahead and end the discussion. Thank you guys so much for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for
Thank you
having
very
us.
much.